He thought she didn't belong in first class, just another misplaced passenger who had wandered too far forward. But he had no idea that in a matter of minutes, the quiet woman he was about to humiliate would turn his entire world upside down as Olivia Hayes stepped onto the aircraft with a calm, unhurried stride. Her soft gray sweater slightly wrinkled from travel and her worn leather flats making almost no sound against the polished aisle floor. The contrast between her simple appearance and the gleaming luxury of the first-class cabin was almost jarring. Rows of wide reclining seats upholstered in cream leather, champagne glasses already waiting on polished trays, and passengers dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses who barely glanced at her before returning to their conversations. Yet one pair of eyes did not look away: the head flight attendant, a man who had spent over a decade mastering the subtle art of reading wealth at a glance, watched her closely as she moved forward, his gaze sharp and calculating, scanning every detail from her modest clothing to the absence of any visible luxury accessories. And in that brief, silent assessment, he had already made his decision. Olivia paused beside seat 2A, glancing down at her boarding pass once more before placing her small carry-on in the overhead bin with quiet efficiency, her movements steady, practiced, almost invisible, but not invisible enough. "Ma'am." The attendant's voice cut cleanly through the low hum of the cabin, polite on the surface yet edged with unmistakable doubt. "I believe economy is toward the back." A few nearby passengers lifted their heads, curiosity flickering across their faces as the moment stretched. Olivia turned slowly, her expression composed, her eyes steady, not defensive, not embarrassed, just present. "This is my assigned seat," she replied softly. Offering her boarding pass without hesitation, the attendant accepted it with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, glancing at it briefly before letting out a quiet, almost dismissive breath. "There must be some confusion," he said, his tone lowering just enough to sound controlled, but not enough to avoid drawing attention. First-class passengers typically check in through a different process. The implication hung in the air, subtle but sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. Olivia felt the shift in the room, the weight of eyes turning, the quiet judgment forming in whispers that weren't quite whispered enough. But she didn't move, didn't argue, didn't shrink. Instead, she simply stood there, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture calm, as if she had all the time in the world, which only seemed to irritate him further. "If you could step aside, ma'am," he continued, gesturing toward the aisle behind her. "We'll resolve this quickly without holding up our premium passengers." The word premium landed with deliberate emphasis, and somewhere in the cabin, a soft chuckle slipped out before being quickly stifled, the atmosphere tightening just enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Olivia's gaze flickered briefly across the cabin, not at the people watching her, but at the space itself, the polished surfaces, the quiet luxury, the invisible line that separated those who belonged from those who didn't, at least in the eyes of people like him. Then she looked back at the attendant and said, just as calmly as before, "I'd prefer to stay where my ticket says I belong." And for a split second, something in her tone shifted the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him pause, though not enough to change his mind, because in his world, appearances were facts, and he had already decided exactly who she was, and more importantly, who she wasn't. And as he straightened his uniform and prepared to escalate the situation, he had no idea that every word he was about to say, every assumption he was about to make, was quietly leading him straight toward a moment he would never forget, a moment when the entire cabin would fall silent, and the balance of power would shift in a way he could never take back. The attendant's smile tightened, the kind that signaled patience wearing thin rather than genuine courtesy, and he took a small step closer to Olivia, as if proximity alone could pressure her into compliance. "Ma'am, I am trying to help you avoid an uncomfortable situation," he said, his voice still measured but now carrying a firmer edge. "This section is reserved for confirmed first-class passengers." He held her boarding pass between two fingers as though it were questionable evidence, glancing down at it again with exaggerated scrutiny before looking back up at her. And around them, the quiet murmur of the cabin began to shift into something more focused, more attentive, as passengers subtly leaned in, their conversations fading into the background, drawn by the tension unfolding just a few feet away. Olivia remained still, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady and calm in a way that seemed almost out of place in the rising discomfort. "That is exactly what this ticket says," she replied, her voice neither defensive nor apologetic, simply factual, and for a brief moment. The clarity of her response created a small crack in the attendant's certainty, but it closed just as quickly as his. Assumptions reasserted themselves, because in his experience, people who belonged did not need to explain themselves, and people who did not belong often try to sound like they did. "I am going to need you to step into the aisle so we can verify this properly," he said, now gesturing more firmly toward the back of the aircraft. And this time the request felt less like assistance and more like instruction. The subtle shift in authority unmistakable. A man seated across the aisle adjusted his cufflinks and watched openly now, no longer pretending not to notice, while a woman 2 rows ahead exchanged a quiet glance with her companion. The kind that said, "This is exactly what we expected." Olivia exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in quiet acknowledgement of the moment. And then she did something that seemed to frustrate him even more. She did not move. Instead, she gently reached for her boarding pass, her fingers brushing his as she took it back, the gesture calm and unhurried. "I understand your concern," she said, her tone still composed, "but I would prefer not to be asked to leave my seat without a clear reason." The words were polite, but they carried a quiet firmness that did not match the role he had already assigned to her. And that mismatch unsettled him more than open resistance would have, because it did not fit the narrative he was trying to enforce. His jaw tightened slightly, and he glanced over his shoulder toward the front galley where another crew member stood watching, silently waiting for his signal. And in that glance, the decision was made. "Very well," he said, turning back to Olivia with a professionalism that now felt rehearsed rather than genuine. "I will have the purser come speak with you." The title alone carried weight, suggesting escalation, suggesting that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding, but something that required higher authority. And as he stepped away, the air in the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Conversations fully paused now, attention sharpened, the kind of silence that was not empty but charged, filled with anticipation. Olivia lowered herself into her seat slowly, her movements deliberate, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if she were simply waiting for a delayed departure rather than standing at the center of a growing scene. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the window, where the runway stretched out under the late afternoon sun, planes moving in the distance with quiet precision, a world that operated on schedules and systems, on rules that were meant to be consistent. And yet here, in this small section of the aircraft, those rules seemed to bend around perception, around assumption, around the unspoken hierarchy of who was believed and who was questioned. A few seconds later, the soft but authoritative footsteps of the purser approached, each step measured, each movement controlled. And when she appeared beside Olivia, her expression was calm but distant, the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. She glanced briefly at the attendant, who gave a subtle nod, and then turned her attention fully to Olivia. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice smooth and composed. "I understand there may be an issue with your seating." And in that moment, as all eyes quietly fixed on the exchange, the situation shifted once again. No longer a question, no longer a misunderstanding, but something heavier, something that carried the weight of judgment already formed. And still, Olivia did not flinch, did not rush to defend herself, did not raise her voice. She simply met the purser's gaze with the same quiet steadiness, as if she already knew something that no one else in that cabin had yet realized. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of the moment, the first ripple of change had already begun. The purser's eyes lingered on Olivia for a moment longer than necessary, not out of curiosity, but calculation, the kind that came from years of making quick decisions based on limited information. And in that brief silence, she had already aligned herself with the version of the story she had been given. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" she asked, her tone courteous but distant. Olivia handed it over without hesitation, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged. And as the purser examined the ticket, her brow tightened almost imperceptibly, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it did not match what she expected to see. "This indicates seat 2A," she said slowly, glancing up at Olivia, then briefly at the attendant who stood a few feet away, arms folded, waiting. Yes, Olivia replied simply, her voice calm. And for a moment, the purser hesitated, caught between what the document clearly stated and what the situation implied. The tension in the cabin deepened, passengers now fully invested, some pretending to scroll through their phones while clearly listening, others watching openly with thinly veiled interest, the kind of quiet audience that made every word feel amplified. Ms. Hayes. The purser continued, reading the name from the ticket. There seems to be some confusion regarding your check-in process. The phrasing was careful, deliberately neutral, but the direction was clear. Our first-class guests typically have verified profiles prior to boarding. Olivia tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in mild curiosity. And my seat assignment was issued at check-in, she responded, her tone still even. So I assumed that verification has already been completed. The logic was simple, undeniable. And for a brief second it disrupted the flow of authority the purser was trying to maintain. But authority, once asserted, rarely retreated easily. We just want to ensure everything is in order, the purser said, her smile tightening just enough to signal control. If you would be willing to step with me for a moment, we can resolve this quickly. Again, the request sounded polite, but the implication was unmistakable. Remove yourself, step out of sight. Allow the situation to be handled away from the eyes that now watched so closely. Olivia's gaze moved across the cabin once more, taking in the subtle shifts, the way people leaned slightly forward, the way silence had replaced conversation, the way judgment had already begun to settle into the space. And then she looked back at the purser, her voice soft but firm. I would prefer to remain here, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any argument could have. It was not confrontational, not emotional, just a quiet refusal to be displaced without reason, and that refusal, calm as it was, created a ripple that neither the purser nor the attendant had anticipated, because it forced the situation to remain visible, to unfold in front of witnesses rather than behind a closed curtain. The purser's expression shifted slightly, professionalism holding, but strain beginning to show at the edges. She glanced once more at the attendant, who gave a subtle nod, and then back at Olivia. If that is the case, she said carefully, we may need to delay departure until this matter is clarified. The words landed heavier than anything said before, not just a suggestion, but a consequence, a pressure point designed to move the situation forward. A few passengers shifted in their seats, discomfort flickering across their faces at the idea of delay, the invisible tension tightening further, and still, Olivia did not react the way they expected. She did not apologize, did not rush to comply. Instead, she simply folded her hands gently in her lap, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, as if time itself had slowed around her. And in that stillness there was something else, something the purser could not quite place, not defiance, not arrogance, but certainty, quiet and unshaken, as though Olivia understood the outcome of this moment long before anyone else in that cabin could even imagine it. And as the silence stretched, thick and unbroken, the balance of control began to shift in ways too subtle for most to notice, but impossible to stop once it had begun. The purser held her position for a moment longer, her professional composure beginning to strain under the quiet resistance she was facing. Because this was not how these situations usually unfolded. People either complied quickly or became visibly upset, but Olivia did neither, and that absence of reaction created a tension that felt far more difficult to control. The attendant shifted his weight slightly, his confidence still intact but now edged with impatience, as if the delay itself had become a personal inconvenience. We are trying to avoid unnecessary disruption, he added, his voice projecting just enough to be heard by those nearby, reinforcing the narrative he had already constructed, a narrative where he was maintaining order and Olivia was the source of the problem. A man seated in the second row leaned back in his chair, watching openly now, his expression unreadable but attentive, while another passenger quietly removed her headphones, drawn fully into the unfolding moment. The cabin had changed, no longer a space of quiet luxury but a stage where perception and assumption were quietly clashing. Olivia remained seated, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly against the armrests, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had unsettled them from the beginning. "I understand your concern about procedure," she said, her tone even. "But delaying a flight over a valid ticket does not seem like the most efficient solution." The words were simple, but they landed with precision, not confrontational, not emotional, just grounded in logic, and that made them harder to dismiss. The purser's eyes flickered briefly, a subtle recognition that the situation was not as straightforward as it had first appeared, but she held her stance, because stepping back now would mean admitting uncertainty in front of a watching audience. And that was something she was not prepared to do. "We are responsible for ensuring all passengers are properly accommodated," she replied, her voice steady but now carrying a faint edge of insistence. "And at the moment, there are questions that need to be resolved." Olivia inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it, and in that small gesture there was something quietly disarming, as if she was not opposing them, but simply allowing the truth to reveal itself in its own time. The attendant glanced again toward the front of the aircraft, then back at Olivia, his patience thinning further. "If you do not cooperate," he said, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone, "we will have no choice but to involve airport staff." The implication hung heavy in the air, a final escalation, a line drawn clearly between compliance and consequence. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the situation pressing in, not because of what was happening, but because of how far it had already gone, and still, Olivia did not react the way they expected. She did not argue, did not protest. Instead, she simply reached into her bag with slow, deliberate movement and pulled out her phone, the small action drawing immediate attention, not because of what it was, but because of how calmly it was done. She looked down at the screen briefly, her expression unchanged, then back up at the purser. "You are welcome to proceed however you feel is necessary," she said softly, her voice carrying no trace of fear or urgency, only quiet assurance. And something in that assurance shifted the air again, subtle but undeniable, because it suggested that whatever came next was not something she was concerned about, and that lack of concern, in a moment designed to pressure her, created a ripple of unease that neither the attendant nor the purser could fully ignore. The purser hesitated for the briefest second, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read something beneath the surface, but the moment passed quickly, replaced by the need to maintain control. "Very well," she said, turning slightly toward the attendant. "Notify ground support." Her words were precise, final, and as the attendant moved to comply, the cabin fell into a deeper silence, the kind that settled heavily, not just with anticipation, but with something else beginning to form beneath it, something that had not yet been named but was quietly building, because while they believed they were escalating the situation, they had no idea that they were stepping directly into a moment that would soon shift everything. And as Olivia sat there, calm and unmoved, her gaze steady and her presence unshaken, it became clear, though not yet to them, that control had already begun to slip from their hands, and the next few minutes would reveal just how much. The cabin remained suspended in a silence that no one dared to break, the kind that pressed gently against every surface, against every breath, as the attendant moved toward the front of the aircraft to make the call he believed would settle everything. His steps measured but just a little faster than before, betraying a confidence that was beginning to thin beneath the surface. The purser stayed where she was, her posture upright, her expression composed, but her eyes no longer as certain as they had been moments ago. She watched Olivia carefully now, not as someone out of place, but as someone she could not quite define, and that uncertainty, small as it was, had already begun to shift the balance in ways she could not yet explain. A soft chime echoed faintly from the cockpit area as pre-departure checks continued, a quiet reminder that time was moving forward even as this moment seemed to stand still. A man in the aisle seat across from Olivia glanced at his watch, then back at the unfolding scene, his patience clearly wearing thin, while another passenger subtly shook her head, the silent language of disapproval now no longer aimed at Olivia, but uncertainly drifting between both sides, because the longer this continued, the less clear it became who was actually in the right. Olivia sat exactly as she had before, her phone now resting loosely in her hand, the screen dark, untouched, her calm presence almost at odds with the tension surrounding her, and yet it was that very calm that had begun to change the atmosphere, because it refused to feed the narrative that had been built around her. The purser finally spoke again, her voice quieter this time, less performative, more controlled. "Ground support will be here shortly," she said, not as a warning now, but as a statement, as if she were reassuring herself as much as anyone else. Olivia gave a small nod, acknowledging the information without reaction, and in that moment, the simplicity of her response carried more weight than any argument could have. The attendant returned from the front, his expression set, but there was something different now, something less rigid, as if the act of escalation had not brought the certainty he expected. "They are sending someone up," he confirmed, his voice no longer projecting, but contained, and the words settled into the cabin with a quiet finality. A few passengers shifted again, the anticipation deepening, because now the situation had moved beyond internal discretion. It had become official, observable, accountable, the kind of moment that could not be easily undone. And still, Olivia remained unchanged, her gaze drifting briefly toward the aisle, then back to the space in front of her, as if she were simply waiting for the next step in a process she already understood. The purser studied her for a second longer, then glanced down at the boarding pass still in her hand, reading the name again silently. Olivia Hayes. The name lingered in her thoughts in a way it had not before, not because it was unfamiliar, but because something about it now felt recognized, though she could not yet place why. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance of the aircraft, deliberate, steady, drawing closer with each passing second, and as that sound reached the edge of the first-class cabin, the air shifted once more, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough that several heads turned in unison, attention drawn instinctively toward the source. The attendant straightened slightly, preparing to present the situation with the same confidence he had carried from the beginning. But beneath that preparation, something else had begun to surface, something quieter, less certain, because deep down, though he would never admit it, there was now a question he could not fully dismiss. And as the figure from ground support stepped into view at the front of the cabin, pausing briefly to take in the scene, the silence deepened into something heavier, something expectant, and in that stillness, as every assumption hung suspended in the air, it became clear that whatever happened next would not simply resolve the situation, it would redefine it. And Olivia, seated calmly at the center of it all, already seemed to know exactly how it would unfold. The man from ground support stepped fully into the first-class cabin, his presence quiet but authoritative in a way that did not need to be announced. His uniform crisp, his badge catching the soft cabin light as he paused just long enough to take in the scene before him. His eyes moved first to the purser, then to the attendant, and finally to Olivia, and in that brief scan something shifted almost instantly, something subtle but unmistakable, the kind of recognition that does not show on the surface but changes everything beneath it. "Good afternoon," he said calmly, his voice steady, measured, carrying none of the tension that had filled the cabin moments before. "I understand there is a situation that needs clarification." The attendant stepped forward quickly, eager to regain control of the narrative. "Yes, we have a passenger seated in first class whose credentials could not be verified through our standard process." His words were precise, confident, rehearsed, but as he spoke, the ground support agent's gaze remained fixed on Olivia, and with each passing second, the confidence in the attendant's voice began to feel slightly out of place, as if it no longer matched the reality forming in the room. "Her boarding pass indicates seat 2A, the attendant continued. "But we need to confirm." "There is no need," the agent said quietly, cutting in without raising his voice, and the interruption, gentle as it was, landed with a weight that immediately altered the tone of the conversation. The attendant blinked, caught mid-sentence, his words falling away as the silence returned. Heavier now, more focused, the agent took a step forward, his attention fully on Olivia, and then, with a small, almost imperceptible shift in posture, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect so natural it could not be mistaken for anything else. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone changing, no longer neutral, but formal, deliberate. "I apologize for the inconvenience." The words echoed softly through the cabin, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because what had just happened did not fit the story they had been watching unfold. The purser's expression froze, her composure holding, but her certainty gone, replaced by something else, something closer to realization. The attendant stood still, his hands at his sides, his posture rigid, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not yet process. Olivia met the agent's gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning, offering a small nod in acknowledgement. Nothing more, no surprise, no reaction, just quiet acceptance, as if this moment had always been inevitable. The agent turned slightly toward the purser, his expression professional but firm. "Her credentials are fully verified," he said, each word clear, leaving no space for interpretation. "There is no discrepancy." The statement settled into the room like a final verdict, and with it, the tension that had been building began to fracture, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with silence, deep and absolute, the kind that follows when certainty collapses all at once. A passenger near the window shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by quiet discomfort, while another lowered her gaze, suddenly uninterested in what had moments ago been impossible to ignore. The purser drew a slow breath, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly as she recalibrated, her voice softer now, more measured. "Of course," she said, though the words carried a faint strain. "Thank you for confirming." The attendant remained silent, his earlier authority now hanging in the air without support, and in that silence, the weight of every assumption he had made seemed to press down all at once. The agent gave a brief nod, then stepped back slightly, his role complete, but the shift he had triggered still unfolding. And at the center of it all, Olivia remained exactly as she had been, composed, grounded, unchanged, her presence now no longer questioned, but undeniable. And as the cabin settled into a new kind of quiet, one not of tension but of realization, it became clear to everyone watching that what they had witnessed was not just a misunderstanding corrected, but a moment where perception had been quietly dismantled, leaving behind something far more difficult to ignore. The truth of how easily respect is given, and how quickly it is taken away. And in that silence, no one dared to speak, because there was nothing left to say. The silence did not break immediately. It lingered, stretching across the cabin like something fragile that no one wanted to disturb, because in that moment, every person present understood, even if only vaguely, that something irreversible had just occurred. The attendant shifted slightly, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but uncertain, almost cautious, as if he were recalibrating his place in a situation that had quietly slipped beyond his control. The purser lowered her gaze. Briefly, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless, and when she looked back at Olivia, there was a difference, subtle yet unmistakable, the absence of judgment, replaced instead by something closer to awareness. "Ms. Hayes," she began, her voice softer now, carefully measured, "we appreciate your patience." The words were correct, professional, but they carried a weight that had not been there before. Olivia met her eyes calmly, offering a small nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology, simply acknowledging it, because for her, this moment was not about validation. It was about something deeper, something quieter, the restoration of a balance that had been disturbed long before she ever took her seat. The attendant opened his mouth as if to speak, then hesitated, the confidence that once fueled his words now replaced by a careful restraint. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said finally, the sentence coming slower than he intended, each word carrying the weight of realization. And for the first time since the situation began, his voice lacked certainty. It was not just an apology. It was an admission, not spoken loudly, but felt clearly. The cabin, once filled with subtle judgment, now held a different kind of stillness, one that reflected inward rather than outward. Passengers who had once watched with curiosity now avoided direct eye contact, their earlier assumptions quietly dissolving in the presence of what had just been revealed. Olivia glanced briefly toward the window again, the fading sunlight casting a soft glow across the wing outside, planes moving in quiet sequence along the runway. a world that continued uninterrupted, indifferent to the small but significant shift that had just taken place inside this cabin. "There was no harm done," she said gently, her voice even, offering a response that was neither dismissive nor indulgent, simply balanced, and that balance carried more weight than any reprimand could have, because it left no room for defensiveness, only reflection. The purser straightened slightly, regaining her professional rhythm, but now grounded in a different awareness. "If there is anything we can do to make your experience more comfortable," she added, her tone sincere, no longer performative. Olivia shook her head lightly. "This seat is fine," she replied, her words simple, but in their simplicity, they carried a quiet finality. The situation was over, not because it had been forced to end, but because it had reached its natural conclusion. The agent from ground support remained near the front for a moment longer, observing quietly, then gave a small nod before stepping back out of the cabin, his presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a space that now felt entirely different from before. The attendant stepped aside, allowing the aisle to clear, his movements more deliberate now, more aware, as if each action carried a new understanding of its impact. A passenger across the aisle adjusted his posture, his earlier confidence replaced by something more subdued, while another reached for her drink, the motion slow, thoughtful. The invisible hierarchy that had once defined the space now softened, blurred by the realization of how easily it could be misjudged. Olivia settled back into her seat, her hands resting calmly once more, her expression unchanged, as if none of this had altered her in the slightest. And perhaps it had not, because the strength she carried was not something that needed to be proven, only revealed. And as the cabin gradually returned to its quiet rhythm, the hum of preparation resuming, announcements faintly echoing from the overhead speakers, one truth lingered, unspoken but deeply understood, that respect, once withheld, does not return the same. And in the stillness that followed, no one questioned where Olivia belonged, because now they all knew. The cabin slowly began to breathe again, not with the same effortless ease it had before, but with a quieter, more deliberate rhythm, as if every person inside had become just a little more aware of the space they occupied and the assumptions they carried into it. The overhead lights softened slightly as the final boarding process neared completion, and the faint sound of the aircraft door preparing to close echoed from the front, a signal that the moment of delay had passed, but the weight of what had just occurred had not. The purser moved gracefully down the aisle, her posture refined, her expression composed, yet there was a new subtlety in her movements, a careful attentiveness that had not been there earlier. She paused briefly beside Olivia once more, this time without authority, without distance. "We will be departing shortly," she said gently, her tone no longer transactional, but genuinely respectful. Olivia offered a small nod, her gaze calm, steady, as if she had already moved beyond the moment while others were still quietly processing it. The attendant remained near the galley, his earlier confidence replaced by a more restrained presence, his movements precise, almost cautious now, as he adjusted a tray and checked the arrangement of glasses, small tasks that allowed him to remain occupied while the shift in atmosphere settled around him. Across the cabin, passengers who had once watched with subtle judgment now sat differently, some looking out the window, others focusing on their screens. But the silence that lingered was not empty. It carried a quiet introspection, a recognition that something deeper than a simple misunderstanding had unfolded. A man who had earlier leaned back with quiet amusement now sat upright, his expression thoughtful, his gaze drifting briefly toward Olivia before turning away, not out of disinterest, but out of something closer to reflection. Olivia rested her hands lightly on the armrests, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, as if the entire experience had passed through her without leaving a mark. And perhaps that was what made it so powerful, not the reaction, but the absence of it, because in a space where so much had been projected onto her, she had remained entirely herself, unmoved by judgment, untouched by doubt. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, announcing the final preparations for departure, the words blending into the background hum of the aircraft. As systems powered up and the subtle vibration of readiness moved through the cabin, A flight attendant further down the aisle began the safety check. Her voice clear, professional, but now carrying a tone that felt slightly more grounded, as if the events that had just unfolded had reached further than anyone would openly admit. The purser returned to the front, exchanging a quiet glance with the attendant, a glance that spoke without words, not of blame, but of understanding, of a lesson learned in real time, the kind that does not require acknowledgement to be felt. Olivia turned her head slightly toward the window, watching as the runway lights stretched out in long glowing lines, the sky above shifting into soft evening hues, and in that quiet moment, there was a sense that everything had settled into its proper place, not because it had been forced, but because it had been revealed. The aircraft began to move slowly, the gentle roll forward signaling the beginning of departure, and as the engines hummed to life, the cabin filled with a steady, reassuring sound, one that carried the promise of movement, of continuation, of leaving something behind without needing to revisit it. And yet, even as the plane prepared to lift from the ground, something remained, not in the air, not in the space, but in the minds of those who had witnessed it. A quiet understanding that respect is not something granted by appearance or status, but something that reveals itself in the way people choose to see one another. And as the aircraft gained speed, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold beyond the window, Olivia remained still, her expression calm, her presence steady, a quiet reminder that dignity does not demand attention. It simply exists, waiting to be recognized. And in that moment, as the plane lifted into the sky, the lesson lingered, unspoken but undeniable, carried with them into the distance. At 30,000 feet above the ground, as the aircraft leveled into its steady climb and the soft hum of the engines settled into a constant rhythm, the cabin seemed to return to its familiar sense of calm. But it was not the same calm that had existed before. It carried something quieter, something deeper, the kind of stillness that follows a moment of realization. Olivia sat by the window, her gaze drifting over the endless stretch of clouds illuminated by the fading light of the evening sun, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, calm, composed, unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. And yet, in the rows behind her and across the aisle, the memory of what had unfolded lingered, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, thoughtful shifts. The man who had once watched with casual interest now sat with his hands folded, his expression subdued, his attention no longer on the surface of things, while the woman who had quietly judged now avoided looking forward altogether, her focus fixed on a magazine she had not turned a page of in several minutes. The purser moved gracefully through the cabin, offering refreshments with a gentleness that had replaced her earlier authority, each interaction measured, each word chosen with care, as if she understood now that professionalism alone was not enough, that something more human, more aware, was required. When she reached Olivia's row, she paused briefly. "May I offer you something to drink?" she asked, her voice soft, respectful, no longer assuming. Olivia turned her head slightly, meeting her gaze, and for a moment, there was no hierarchy, no distance, just two people sharing a quiet exchange. "Water would be perfect, thank you," she replied, her tone warm but simple, and as the purser handed her the glass, their eyes met again, not as strangers navigating a misunderstanding, but as individuals who had just shared a moment. Neither would forget. The attendant remained further down the aisle, his movements careful, deliberate, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that lingered in everything he did. He glanced once toward Olivia, then quickly looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, a silent acknowledgement of something he had learned too late to prevent, but not too late to understand. The seatbelt sign chimed softly as it turned off, and a few passengers shifted, adjusting their positions, but the energy in the cabin remained grounded, reflective, as if the entire space had absorbed the lesson without needing it to be spoken aloud. Olivia lifted the glass of water, taking a small sip, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, and in that simple moment, there was a quiet strength that did not demand recognition, because it did not need it. Outside the window, the sky deepened into shades of blue and gold, the horizon stretching endlessly, a reminder of how vast the world was beyond the narrow judgments that had briefly defined this small space. And as the plane continued forward, cutting smoothly through the evening sky, the truth of what had happened settled gently into every corner of the cabin, not as a story to be retold, but as a perspective to be carried forward, that dignity is not something granted by position, wealth, or appearance, but something inherent, something that reveals itself in the quiet moments where character is tested and assumptions are exposed. And though no one spoke it aloud, though no announcement marked its significance, everyone who had witnessed it carried that understanding with them, in the way they sat, in the way they looked at one another, in the way they would choose, perhaps differently now, to see the next person who walked quietly into a space where they did not seem to belong. And as Olivia rested back in her seat, her eyes returning to the horizon, the cabin finally settled into a true silence, not one of tension, but one of clarity, where nothing more needed to be said, because everything that mattered had already been shown.